Hey guys, tonight we begin with the mysterious world of the Phoenicians, those seafaring traders who invented the alphabet you're reading right now and created an empire not through conquest, but through commerce. Before we drift into the ancient Mediterranean, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear, the Phoenicians never called themselves Phoenicians. That was a Greek name, probably meaning purple people. And yes, there's a reason for that ridiculous nickname. We'll get to the purple obsession in a moment. These people lived along a narrow coastal strip, modern-day Lebanon, barely 200 miles long and 30 miles wide. Think of it as ancient Rhode Island, but with better ships and significantly more trade routes. They didn't have a unified empire, no grand capital city, no single king shouting orders from a golden throne. Instead, the Phoenicians organized themselves into independent city-states: Tyre, Sidon, Byblos. Each city competed fiercely with the others, kind of like medieval Italian city-states, but with more purple dye and fewer Renaissance paintings. These weren't warriors, they were merchants. While their neighbors were busy building armies and conquering land, the Phoenicians were building ships and conquering markets. And honestly, that's probably why you've barely heard of them. History loves a good battle, but accounting ledgers, not so much. Congratulations, you've just been hired as a Phoenician dye worker. Your job, crushing tens of thousands of sea snails. The smell. Imagine rotting shellfish mixed with old gym socks, fermented in the Mediterranean sun for weeks. That's your daily perfume now. The Phoenicians discovered that a tiny gland inside the murex sea snail produced a spectacular purple dye. But here's the nightmare part. Each snail produced exactly 2 drops. 2 to make 1 single gram of dye. You needed to harvest, crush, and process between 10,000 and 20,000 snails. Do the math. 1 gram. That's about the weight of a paperclip. Requires slaughtering an entire snail ecosystem. Your hands would be stained purple permanently. Your clothes, purple. Your skin, purple. Even your hair probably had a purple tint by the end of the week. And the process, first, you had to collect thousands of these spiky little shells from the seafloor. Then crack each one open at exactly the right spot. Extract the tiny gland. Only then could you begin the actual dye-making process. The extracted material had to be placed in large stone vats, mixed with salt water, and left to ferment in the sun for days. The chemical reaction slowly transformed the secretion from yellowish green to purple. But during that transformation, the smell intensified. Hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, rotting protein. It was so bad that dye production facilities were built on the outskirts of cities, downwind. Nobody wanted to live near a purple dye factory. Archaeological excavations around ancient Tyre and Sidon have discovered mountains of discarded murex shells. Some piles measured over 40 meters high. Millions upon millions of shells. The Phoenicians harvested these snails so aggressively that they nearly drove the species to extinction along the Lebanese coast. But why go through all this trouble? Because purple became the color of power. The dye was so expensive that only royalty and the ultra-wealthy could afford it. A pound of purple-dyed fabric cost roughly the same as a pound of gold. In some markets, it was worth even more. Roman emperors wore togas edged in Tyrian purple. The color became so associated with imperial authority that laws were passed restricting who could wear it. If you were caught wearing purple without permission, you could be executed. That's right. Fashion violations carry the death penalty. For the Phoenicians, this meant steady, massive profits. They had a monopoly on the most desired luxury product in the ancient world, and they guarded their production methods obsessively. The exact chemical process was a closely kept secret, passed down through families of dye makers. So yes, your hands permanently stained, your lungs damaged from fumes, your social life non-existent, because everyone avoided the purple people who smelled like death. But hey, at least you were contributing to an economic empire. So you've decided to become a Phoenician trader. Excellent choice. You'll spend most of your life at sea, sleeping on wooden planks, eating salted fish, and praying. The next storm doesn't send you to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Phoenician merchant ships were technological marvels for their time, built from Lebanese cedar. These vessels featured curved hulls, reinforced keels, and a single square sail. They could carry tons of cargo, but comfort, not a priority. Your typical trading voyage might last months. You'd leave Tyre loaded with purple-dyed fabric, glassware, and cedar logs. Sail west along the North African coast, stop at Carthage, your most important colony, then continue on to Sicily, Sardinia, even Spain. At each port, you'd trade, barter, negotiate. The Phoenicians didn't use coins initially. Everything was exchange. Your purple cloth for Egyptian grain, your glassware for Spanish silver, your cedar for Cypriot copper. And you had to be sharp. One bad deal could ruin you. The competition was brutal. Greek traders were expanding. Local merchants tried to undercut you. Pirates lurked along every major route. And if you were too successful, some local king might just decide to rob you and claim it was taxes. The night was the worst part. Anchored in some foreign harbor, surrounded by people who spoke different languages, sleeping with one eye open because your cargo was worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. And the food, dried fish, hard bread, whatever local provisions you could buy, fresh water was always a concern. You carried it in clay jars, but it went stale quickly in the heat. Disease was constant, cramped quarters, no sanitation, rats everywhere. If one person got sick on a long voyage, everyone got sick, and medical knowledge, well, they believed illness came from bad air and angry gods. So, treatment involved burning incense and praying. Not exactly effective, though. But if you survived, if you made it home with your cargo intact and your profits secure, you could become wealthy. Phoenician merchants lived in fine stone houses, wore jewelry, owned slaves. Some even commissioned their own ships, built trade networks that spanned the known world. The most successful merchants didn't just trade, they established permanent outposts, small colonies where they could store goods, repair ships, and create forward operating bases for future trade. Carthage started as just such an outpost, a convenient stop on the way to Spain. Eventually, it became one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world. Here's something that would terrify modern sailors. The Phoenicians sailed without compasses, without GPS, without even proper maps. They navigated using stars, landmarks, and sheer experience. During the day, they followed the coastline, keeping land in sight whenever possible. They memorized every bay, every headland, every distinctive rock formation. Older sailors would teach younger ones, this mountain means you're near Carthage. That island cluster marks the entrance to Sicily. But the real skill came at night, when the Phoenicians became the first civilization to reliably use celestial navigation. They identified the North Star, called it the Phoenician Star by some accounts, and used it to maintain direction when sailing after sunset. This gave them an enormous advantage. Most other ancient peoples refused to sail at night. Too dangerous, too easy to get lost. But the Phoenicians mastered it. They could sail 24 hours a day when needed, covering distances their competitors couldn't match. They also learned to read the sea itself, current patterns, watercolor, wave behavior, bird movements. An experienced Phoenician captain could tell you how far from land you were based on the type of seaweed floating by, or predict a storm by watching cloud formations most people wouldn't even notice. Their ships were designed for both speed and cargo capacity. The merchant vessels had rounded hulls, making them stable in rough seas, but they were also slow, easy targets for pirates. So the Phoenicians developed warships, sleeker vessels with 2 rows of oars, called birems. These could be rowed at high speed even without wind, and they featured a bronze ram at the prow. In battle, the strategy was simple. Row full speed at an enemy ship, smash the ram through their hull, watch them sink. Oarsmen on these warships. Not a fun job. You sat on a hard bench, rowing for hours, sometimes days, in synchronized rhythm with dozens of other men. If the ship was rammed, you were chained to your oar, so you drowned. No escape, but at least it was steady work. Now, let's talk about the Phoenicians' greatest contribution to human civilization. The alphabet you're reading right now, they didn't invent writing, but they revolutionized it. Before the Phoenicians, writing was complicated. Egyptian hieroglyphics used hundreds of symbols. Mesopotamian cuneiform was even worse, thousands of characters, each representing words or complex syllables. Learning to write took years of training. Only professional scribes bothered, which meant literacy was restricted to the elite, priests, government officials, the wealthy. The Phoenicians looked at this system and thought, this is ridiculous. We're merchants. We need something simple, something any trader can learn in a few weeks, something that makes record keeping, contracts, and shipping manifests actually feasible. So they simplified. They took existing symbols, probably derived from earlier Canaanite scripts, and reduced them to 22 consonants, just 22. Each symbol represented a single sound, not a word, not a syllable, just a sound, no vowels. That might seem strange. But in Semitic languages, consonants carry most of the meaning. Readers familiar with the language could fill in the vowels themselves, and it was like reading T, X, T, M, S, G, word to N, V, W, Ls. If you know the language, your brain fills in the gaps. This system was brilliant. A merchant could learn it in weeks, not years. Suddenly, literacy wasn't restricted to an elite class. Any trader, any ship captain, any warehouse manager could read and write. This democratized information in a way that fundamentally changed society. And because Phoenician traders went everywhere, their alphabet went everywhere. Greek traders adopted it, added vowels, created the Greek alphabet. The Romans took the Greek alphabet, modified it, created Latin, which became the foundation for English, French, Spanish, Italian, and dozens of other languages, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, all descended from or influenced by the Phoenician alphabet. The letters you're reading right now on your screen, in whatever language, trace their ancestry back to Phoenician merchants who just wanted a quick way to write down how many jars of olive oil they were shipping to Carthage. Think about that. The single most important communication tool in human history, the alphabet, exists because ancient purple dye merchants needed better bookkeeping. The Phoenicians didn't conquer, they franchised. Instead of sending armies, they sent traders who established colonies, trading posts that grew into cities. Carthage, their most famous colony, started as a small outpost on the North African coast, founded by settlers from Tyre around 800 BCE. The story goes that a Phoenician princess named Dido fled a power struggle, landed on the coast of modern Tunisia, and struck a deal with the local king. She asked for as much land as could be covered by an ox hide. The king agreed, thinking he was giving away almost nothing. But Dido was clever. She cut the ox hide into incredibly thin strips, then laid them out in a circle, enclosing a massive area. The king had to honor his agreement, and Carthage was founded. Whether that story is true, who knows? But Carthage grew rapidly. Within a few centuries, it eclipsed its mother city Tyre, became a major power in its own right. Eventually, challenged Rome for control of the Western Mediterranean. Spoiler alert, that didn't end well for Carthage, but that's another story. The Phoenicians also established colonies in Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, the Balearic Islands, even Spain. Places like Cadiz, which claims to be one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. Founded by Phoenicians around 1100 BCE, some historians believe they sailed even further. Ancient sources suggest Phoenician ships may have reached the Atlantic coast of Africa, possibly circumnavigated the entire continent, centuries before any European explorer. There are even wild theories about Phoenicians reaching the Americas, but hard evidence for that is lacking. What we know for certain is that these colonies created a trade network spanning thousands of miles, from the Levant to Spain, from North Africa to the Black Sea. Goods flowed constantly. Purple dye going west, silver and tin coming east, Egyptian grain, Cypriot copper, African ivory. It all moved through Phoenician hands. Imagine waking up in ancient Tyre. Your house is made of stone, multi-story if you're wealthy, single story if you're not. Either way, it's hot. The Mediterranean sun doesn't care about your comfort. The city is crowded. Narrow streets wind between buildings, no urban planning, just organic growth over centuries. The streets are busy from dawn, merchants setting up stalls, donkeys carrying cargo, slaves hauling water. The smell is intense, sweat, animals, the ever-present tang of the sea. And if the wind is blowing from the dye works, well, you already know about that smell. If you're a craftsman, your day starts early. Glassmakers fire up their furnaces. The Phoenicians were famous for their glass. They didn't invent it, but they perfected techniques that made Phoenician glass a luxury export. Delicate vessels, colorful beads, some pieces so fine they look modern. Metal workers hammer bronze, create jewelry, fashion, tools and weapons. Woodworkers carve furniture from Lebanese cedar, the same timber that built their ships and temples and sold for outrageous prices to timber-poor Egypt and Mesopotamia. Women manage households, weave textiles. Some run family businesses while their husbands are at sea for months. Phoenician women had more economic freedom than women in many ancient cultures. Necessity. When your husband might drown in a storm, someone needs to know how to run the shop. Children help with whatever work needs doing. Apprentice with craftsmen. Learn to read and write the alphabet. If their family can afford education, which, for merchant families, was actually fairly common. You can't run a business if you can't keep records. Food is Mediterranean. Bread, olive oil, fish, lots of fish. Some goat or lamb if you can afford it. Wine diluted with water. Honey for sweetness. The wealthy eat better. Import luxuries. But even common people eat reasonably well. The sea provides, and trade brings grain from Egypt when local harvests fall short. Religion permeates everything. Each city has patron deities. Baal and Astarte are popular. Melkart and Tyre. Temples dominate the skyline. Priests hold significant power. Religious festivals mark the calendar, some involving animal sacrifices, others featuring processions, music, dance, and yes, there were darker rituals too. Ancient sources claim the Phoenicians and their Carthaginian descendants practiced child sacrifice. Modern scholars debate this. Some say it's propaganda from enemies like the Romans. Others point to archaeological evidence suggesting it might be true. The truth, lost to time. But the reputation, that stuck. The Phoenicians weren't just traders. They were innovators. Their glass-making techniques spread throughout the Mediterranean. They didn't invent glass, but they refined production methods, created new colors, developed blown glass techniques that made production faster and cheaper. Their ships represented cutting-edge naval engineering. The design of the bireme, 2 rows of oars, one above the other, allowed for more power without making the ship too wide. This made Phoenician warships faster and more maneuverable than anything else in the Mediterranean for centuries. They developed advanced textile production. Beyond just purple dye, they created intricate weaving patterns, fine linens, embroidered fabrics that became status symbols across the ancient world. Metallurgy was another strength. Phoenician bronze work was renowned. They imported copper from Cyprus, tin from as far away as Britain, mixed them in precise ratios to create bronze of exceptional quality. Their weapons, tools, and decorative items were prized possessions. They even made advances in agriculture. Despite living on a narrow coastal strip with limited farmland, they developed terrace farming techniques, irrigation systems, crop rotation. They grew olives, grapes, various grains, enough to feed themselves, though they still imported food from more agricultural regions. Urban planning in Phoenician cities showed sophistication. Multi-story buildings, underground cisterns for water storage, harbor facilities with protective breakwaters, warehouses strategically located near docks. They understood logistics in ways that wouldn't be matched until much later. Eventually, the Phoenician cities faced a problem. Being commercially successful made you a target. Every empire in the region wanted a piece of that wealth. The Assyrians came first, around 800 BCE, demanding tribute. The Phoenician cities paid, kept trading, stayed semi-autonomous. Then came the Babylonians. Same story, pay tribute, maintain independence, keep the ships sailing. The Persians were next. They actually treated the Phoenicians relatively well, recognized their value, used Phoenician ships to build the Persian navy. The Phoenicians even fought for Persia against the Greeks. Their ships were crucial at battles like Salamis, though, spoiler, Persia lost that one. Then Alexander the Great arrived, 332 BCE. He besieged Tyre. The city was built on an island, protected by the sea. Phoenicians thought they were safe. Alexander disagreed. He built a causeway, a massive land bridge from the mainland to the island, using rubble, destroyed buildings, whatever he could throw into the sea. The siege lasted 7 months. Tyre held out longer than any other city Alexander faced, but eventually it fell. The slaughter was brutal. Alexander made an example of them, killed thousands, sold survivors into slavery. Tyre never fully recovered its former glory. After Alexander, the Phoenician cities in the east became part of the Hellenistic world. Greek culture dominated. The Phoenician language and identity began to fade. In the west, Carthage carried on, became the last great Phoenician power. But Rome had other ideas. The Punic Wars, 3 brutal conflicts, Rome versus Carthage. By 146 BCE, Carthage was destroyed, literally. The Romans tore down every building, killed or enslaved the population, supposedly sowed the earth with salt so nothing would grow. That last part is probably propaganda. But the destruction was real enough. With Carthage gone, Phoenician civilization effectively ended. The cities that remained became thoroughly Romanized. The language disappeared. The culture was absorbed. The people assimilated. Now, as we drift deeper into tonight's journey, let's explore something equally fascinating. The city that became the Phoenicians' greatest colony, and eventually their most powerful successor, Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre around 800 BCE. Carthage started as just another trading post, one of dozens scattered across the Mediterranean. But this one became something special. The location was perfect. A peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean on the North African coast. Natural harbors on both sides. Fertile agricultural land nearby. And positioned perfectly to control trade between the eastern and western Mediterranean. Early Carthage followed the Phoenician model. Trade, not conquest. They built ships, established their own colonies, created trade networks. But they also did something their mother cities never quite managed. They unified, built a real centralized state, not just a loose collection of city-states. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage controlled most of the western Phoenician colonies, Sicily, Sardinia, the North African coast, southern Spain. They had become the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. Rome was still a regional Italian power. Athens was just hitting its golden age, and Carthage was getting rich. Their wealth came from the same sources as their Phoenician ancestors: trade, purple dye, glassware, metalwork. But they added something new: agricultural exploitation of North Africa. They developed intensive farming techniques, grew grain for export, created olive plantations. The aristocratic families of Carthage owned vast estates worked by slaves. The city itself was magnificent. Ancient sources describe it as one of the most beautiful cities in the Mediterranean. Massive defensive walls, harbors that could shelter hundreds of ships, a circular military harbor with a central island, where the Carthaginian navy kept 220 warships under covered docks, protected from the weather and hidden from prying eyes. The population swelled, perhaps 400,000 at its peak, making it one of the largest cities of the ancient world. Only Alexandria and Rome could compare. The streets were laid out in a grid pattern. Multi-story apartment buildings housed the working classes. Grand estates overlooked the harbors. Temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit dominated the skyline. Carthaginian democracy was complicated. They had elected officials called suffets, kind of like consuls in Rome, a senate of several hundred members from the aristocracy, and a popular assembly that could vote on major decisions. But real power stayed with the wealthy families, the ones who owned the land, controlled the trade, built the ships. Unlike their peaceful Phoenician ancestors, the Carthaginians had to fight. Defending Sicily brought them into conflict with Greek city-states. Defending their African territories meant dealing with Berber kingdoms. And eventually, defending their dominance brought them into conflict with Rome. The Carthaginian military was unique. Their army was almost entirely mercenary. Soldiers hired from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Numidian cavalry from North Africa, Iberian infantry from Spain, Balearic slingers, Gallic warriors, Greek hoplites, even war elephants. The Carthaginians used war elephants in battle centuries before they became famous under Hannibal. This created advantages and problems. Advantages: you could field massive armies without depleting your own population, hire specialists from different regions, get the best cavalry from Numidia, the toughest infantry from Spain. Problems: mercenaries fight for pay, not patriotism. If you can't pay them, they might switch sides, or worse, turn on you. The Carthaginian navy, though, that was all Carthaginian. They built on Phoenician shipbuilding traditions, created quinqueremes, massive ships with 5 rows of oars, faster than anything Rome had, at least initially. Carthaginian admirals were trained from childhood. Naval warfare was in their blood. They expanded aggressively, controlled most of Sicily except for Greek cities like Syracuse, dominated Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, southern Spain with its rich silver mines. They even explored down the African coast, established trading posts. Some sources suggest they reached as far as the equator, though evidence is scarce. Their wealth was staggering. Spanish silver mines alone brought in tons of precious metal annually. Trade goods flowed through Carthaginian ports. Agricultural products from their African territories. They became one of the richest states in the Mediterranean world, but that wealth made them a target, and their greatest rival was rising across the sea. Rome, still expanding through Italy, building its own empire, on a collision course with Carthage. The First Punic War started over Sicily, 264 BCE. A dispute about control of a city led to 23 years of brutal warfare. Rome and Carthage, two powers that had mostly ignored each other, suddenly locked in total war. The Romans had a problem. They were a land power, great soldiers, excellent organization, but almost no navy. The Carthaginians controlled the seas. Their ships were better, their sailors more experienced. Their admirals had centuries of naval tradition to draw on. So the Romans did something typically Roman. They studied captured Carthaginian ships, reverse engineered them, built an entire fleet based on Punic designs, then added an innovation, the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike. It would slam down onto enemy ships, lock them together, and Roman soldiers would swarm across, turning naval battles into land battles. The Carthaginians didn't see it coming. Suddenly, their naval superiority meant nothing. Roman soldiers were boarding their ships, fighting hand to hand. The Romans won battle after battle, lost entire fleets to storms, built new ones, kept coming. After 23 years, Carthage sued for peace. They evacuated Sicily, paid a massive indemnity. The Romans had won, gained their first overseas territory, but the peace was unstable. Both sides knew this wasn't over. 23 years later, the Second Punic War, the famous one, Hannibal Barca, son of a Carthaginian general who had conquered much of Spain, decided to attack Rome, not by sea, but by land, through the Alps, with elephants. Hannibal's march is the stuff of legend. 218 BCE, he left Spain with around 50,000 soldiers, 37 elephants, and a plan that seemed insane. Cross the Pyrenees, march through southern Gaul, cross the Alps, invade Italy. The Alpine crossing was a nightmare. Narrow mountain passes, early winter snow, hostile local tribes, soldiers and animals falling off cliffs. The cold killed thousands. Most of the elephants died. By the time Hannibal reached Italy, his army was reduced by half, but he made it, and he brought terror with him. At the Battle of Trebia, he crushed a Roman army. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed and destroyed another. Then came Cannae, 216 BCE, the most devastating defeat in Roman history. Hannibal faced a Roman army of over 80,000 soldiers. He had about 50,000, but he was a tactical genius. He deliberately weakened his center, drew the Romans forward, then had his cavalry sweep around and attack from behind. The Romans were surrounded, trapped, slaughtered. Estimates suggest 50,000 to 70,000 Romans died that day. In a single afternoon, it was the worst military disaster Rome ever suffered. Hannibal could have marched on Rome itself. Many of his officers begged him to, but he didn't. Maybe the walls were too strong. Maybe he lacked siege equipment. Maybe he hoped Rome would surrender. They didn't. Rome refused to quit. They changed tactics, avoided open battle, harassed Hannibal's forces, cut his supply lines, and here's where being a mercenary army hurt Carthage. Hannibal couldn't replace his losses. Rome could. Romans kept recruiting, building armies, losing battles, recruiting again. Hannibal stayed in Italy for 15 years, undefeated in open battle, but slowly his army withered. His reinforcements never came. Carthage was fighting on multiple fronts: Spain, Sicily, North Africa. They couldn't send enough help. Meanwhile, a young Roman general named Scipio, who had studied Hannibal's tactics, invaded North Africa, threatened Carthage itself. The Carthaginian government panicked, recalled Hannibal, made him fight on Carthaginian soil. The Battle of Zama, 202 BCE, Hannibal versus Scipio, the student facing the master, and Scipio won, used Hannibal's own tactics against him. The war was over. Carthage had lost again. The peace terms were brutal. Carthage had to give up all territories except North Africa, pay a crushing war indemnity over 50 years, reduce their navy to 10 ships. Basically, they were neutered, no longer a military threat, just a wealthy trading city. And they recovered, because Carthaginians were good at making money. Within 50 years, they had paid off the indemnity, rebuilt their economy, become prosperous again, which terrified Rome. In the Roman Senate, there was a senator named Cato the Elder who ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the same phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. He saw Carthaginian economic recovery as a threat, and he convinced Rome to act. The Third Punic War, 149 BCE, was barely a war, more like an execution. Rome demanded Carthage disarm completely. The Carthaginians agreed, handed over all their weapons. Then Rome made a final demand: abandon your city, move 10 miles inland, rebuild there. That was impossible. Carthage's power came from the sea, from trade, from harbors. Moving inland meant death, so the Carthaginians chose to fight, defenseless, against Rome. They improvised weapons. Women cut their hair to make bowstrings. They held out for 3 years. But in 146 BCE, Roman soldiers broke through. The fighting was house to house, street by street. It took 6 days to completely conquer the city. The Carthaginians fought to the last. Survivors were enslaved. 50,000 people sold into slavery. Then the Romans systematically destroyed everything, tore down every building, burned what wouldn't tear down. Ancient sources say they plowed the ruins and sowed them with salt. The salt part is probably myth, but the destruction was real enough. Carthage, the greatest Phoenician city, the last heir to that ancient trading civilization, was gone, erased, ended. Rome stood supreme, unchallenged in the Western Mediterranean. So the Phoenicians are gone, their cities destroyed or assimilated, their language dead, their culture absorbed into the Roman world. What's left? Everything. Every time you write a letter, you're using their alphabet, modified through Greek and Latin, but descended from those 22 Phoenician consonants, the foundation of Western literacy. That's Phoenician. Every time you see something purple and associate it with royalty, that's Phoenician. They created that connection, made purple the color of power, a cultural association that persists 3,000 years later. maritime trade routes they pioneered, still used today, the principles of international commerce, trading posts in foreign lands, commercial colonies, joint ventures with local partners. The Phoenicians invented or perfected all of it. Shipbuilding techniques they developed influenced naval architecture for centuries. The design of the bareme, the use of rams in naval warfare, navigation by stars, all Phoenician innovations that spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Even their religion left traces. Baal worship influenced Judaism, Christianity, Islam. The goddess Astarte became Aphrodite in Greek, Venus in Roman. The religious practices of the ancient Phoenicians echoed through later Mediterranean religions in ways scholars are still untangling. Glass-making techniques they perfected spread throughout the Roman Empire, eventually leading to the spectacular glass windows of medieval cathedrals, the fine glassware of Venice, all descendants of Phoenician innovation, the very concept of a trade empire. Building wealth through commerce rather than conquest, the Phoenicians proved it could work. For 1,000 years, they dominated Mediterranean trade, not through military might, but through superior ships, better products, and an alphabet that made record-keeping simple. Carthage's legacy is darker but no less important. They proved that a republic could build an empire, that citizen soldiers weren't always superior to professional armies, that naval power could rival land power. Rome learned from fighting Carthage, adapted, improved, built their own commercial empire partly by copying what worked for the Phoenicians. So, could you have survived as a Phoenician merchant? Probably not. The smell alone would break most people. Purple dye production, rotting snails, for months no escape, your hands permanently stained, your social life destroyed, living downwind from everyone else because nobody wants to be near you. The sea travel, months on wooden ships, storms that could sink you without warning, pirates lurking at every port, disease spreading through cramped quarters, no fresh food, no clean water, just salted fish and hope. The business pressure. One bad deal ruins you. Competition is ruthless. Greek traders undercutting your prices. Local merchants trying to cheat you. Foreign kings demanding bribes, or just taking your cargo and calling it taxes. And if you fail, your family starves. No bankruptcy protection. No government bailout. Just poverty and shame. The violence. Pirates attack your ship. You're expected to fight. Not hide below deck. Actual hand-to-hand combat with swords and spears, blood and death. And if you survive that, maybe you get caught in a war between Carthage and Rome. Your ship requisitioned, you pressed into service. Now you're ramming enemy vessels, boarding them, fighting soldiers who want to kill you. The alphabet you invented, sure, that's nice. But it doesn't help when you're seasick, starving, and watching storm clouds roll in while you're still 3 days from port. The wealth, yes. Successful merchants became rich, but most didn't succeed. Most died young, lost everything to a single storm, got killed by pirates, or caught some disease in a foreign port and died alone, far from home. The Phoenicians built a civilization through sheer stubbornness. They lived on a narrow strip of coast with limited resources, so they looked to the sea. They were surrounded by military empires, so they became indispensable through trade. They lacked political unity, so they created economic networks that didn't require central control. It was brilliant. It was innovative. It changed the world. But it was also brutal, dangerous, and exhausting. A life spent chasing profit across dangerous seas, living in foreign ports, dealing with hostile cultures, all to sell purple fabric and glass beads to wealthy people who looked down on merchants. Could you handle it? The constant travel, the mortal danger, the smell, the hard labor, the uncertain profits, the knowledge that one mistake, one storm, one pirate attack could end everything. Most of us couldn't. We're too soft, too comfortable, too used to safe jobs, reliable paychecks, not worrying whether today's voyage might be our last. The Phoenicians lived differently. They embraced risk, sailed into the unknown, built something remarkable with nothing but cedar trees, sea snails, and an alphabet. They weren't warriors. They were merchants. But they changed the history more than most armies ever did. And then they vanished, conquered, destroyed, absorbed, leaving behind only their alphabet, their purple dye, and memories of ships that once ruled the Mediterranean. So no, you wouldn't have lasted as a Phoenician merchant, but the world you live in, the alphabet you read, the color purple on your screen, the very concept of international trade, that's all Phoenician. Their civilization died, but their legacy, that survived.